All right. Good morning. All right. Hello and welcome. This is the community stand-up for Data API Builder, and it's been a little bit longer than usual because of the 4th of July. So we had to push for a week. A handful of things are happening right now, and this is actually a sleepy time when it comes to Microsoft. Everybody is taking their vacations, and so it's a fun time to kind of reflect back and do some planning on what's coming next. Some of the things that are going on, you can find us on our repository at AKMS /dab and find our repository there and look at the activities that are going on, the discussions, as well as some of the more in-depth issues now that are starting to kind of take shape as well. Right now, I've got Sean. Sean's been on the show before. I'm going to bring him on now. Sean's been on the show before. Sean's one of our engineers for Data API Builder. And Sean, you were on the show with us not so long ago when we were talking about the introduction of in-memory cache inside DAB. Thanks for being back with us again today.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, seems just like yesterday that we were talking about that.
Yeah, it's funny. What's crazy is that is such a punctuated feature that I talk about it constantly. I do feel like I'm constantly talking about cache because it's so valuable. But at the same time, Davide is on a trip right now to Italy, visiting his home, and so he's not with us today either. So a lot of things are happening and kind of in the air. But today, what we want to focus on is a little less of what was in the last release, because we don't really have a last release since our last community stand-up. We will have one more than likely before our next one. That being said, what we really want to focus on is really Data API Builder as a community. And if I were a developer thinking about how to get involved in the open source side of Data API Builder, what would be the next step for me? What would be the next set of things that I need to do to make sure that I can build it, get it to run locally, understand kind of how the general file system is laid out, understand how to get tests running so that my PRs are more likely to pass, things along those lines. And so that's why Sean's here with us today to talk a little bit about that. Before we do, though, I want to just make a point of saying that the docs continue to evolve. There are quite a few new features in the docs, and I want to kind of drive you to the reference section where there are where you can go into the configuration file, and every single section of the configuration file is documented. I've gotten a lot of feedback from a lot of different developers using DAB who have suggested changes here and there, and we tried to incorporate all the changes that happen there. You'll find a lot of updates coming to the doc probably every week, and little things here and there to make sure that they're nice, making sure that the samples make sense to everybody, and fixing anything that may be an error. Overall, it's actually one of the best blocks of documentation in Microsoft Learn, if you ask me. It's really a great section overall. All that being said, we have probably a shorter session today than we would on a normal day because of what we're going to be talking about. So, Sean, I'm going to let you share your screen with me here, and I'll stage that in so that we can see it. While that's happening, I'll just point out there's a couple of more things that are in the future for DAB as far as evangelism. So there are several sessions being that are focusing on DAB in the future. One of them is going to be around in VS Live. So if you're going to VS Live next month, and that's at the Microsoft headquarters up in Redmond, and if you are going to be there, then you'll be able to see me. Davide is presenting as well, and we have several sessions that will involve Data API Builder. If you're going to participate in or watch the Aspire conference that's coming up at the end of next month, then we'll have a session there as well where we'll be talking about Aspire and SQL Server, and we'll talk about Data API Builder in that context as well. So a lot of neat things coming up where we'll be able to see you in other places. And so hopefully you'll be able to see Data API Builder showing up in a conference or a community event that you go to next. If you have a community event that you are interested in getting us involved in, be sure and let me know, and we'll do our best to participate. All right, Sean, I see your screen, and so here we go. And
awesome.
Great. So just as a reminder, let's make the prerequisite. I'm a pretty seasoned developer. You don't have anything along those lines, but I've never actually participated in this repository. And so walk me through what the steps would be. And because you're one of the engineers reviewing PRs as they come through, this will be great because you can tell us what you really like to see as well.
Sure. So just to start off, this is the main page of our repository. And so anytime you want to actually make a change, first things first is from your own view, cloning the repo down to your local machine to get all the files and everything into Visual Studio or VS Code, depending on what you use as your daily driver. And just a note before we dive into that, we do have a contributing doc that gives a good overview on what it looks like to contribute code and open issues and get started locally with not only adding new code, but also running the tests to ensure that everything else that has previously been worked on still continues to work. So this would be a great first place to go through and just glance through and just get a good overview of what we may expect to have you get started and get everything up and running. So I'm not going to read this word for word, but I'll take you directly into my own instance of Visual Studio for taking a look at some of our code here. So this has information on running tests for all the different databases that we support. So one of the key points here is that DAB does work with MS SQL, so Azure SQL, SQL Server, Postgres, MySQL, and Cosmos. And so there are different mechanisms that you need to use to get the test running for those, but I'll focus on SQL Server today just to kind of scope this down into maybe making a small change for the SQL side and just showing you what that would look like to get that pushed up into GitHub. Little things on code style, but it's kind of this is obviously room for addition and making things improved here. But let's go ahead and jump into the code editor here. So before I actually open any of these tests here, let's take a look into the Solution Explorer. Let's see if I can zoom in. I don't know if it'll actually let me do that here. Might be better just to start off from GitHub just so you can see everything. So everything code-wise is in the source folder. So we have a number of projects here that are related to everything GraphQL, everything REST in DAB. And so the entry point for the entire project is going to come down into this service folder. And we have startup and program. So everything related to how we configure all of our services for DAB. So there's a lot of startup that goes up that occurs when you boot up DAB. So anytime you press DAB start from the CLI, we're going to be loading in all of your configuration, loading in all of the app insights configuration, all of the logging factories, the health checks, everything that you see here, especially with metadata providers and everything there. So anytime that you're going to be adding a new service, this is probably the very first place that all of that is going to need to be added. Um, so that would be the service project. Without going too deep, I think one of the other important things to look at just to get a lay of the land would be in our configuration project. So whenever you think of DAB or think about the DAB config, if you've used DAB, you probably used DAB before wanting to go in and make some changes. So the first thing you'll probably think of is the DAB configuration. So you'll think of entities, the various database objects that you want to expose within your GraphQL schema or REST endpoint. And so within the configuration project, you're going to find our object model. And that's going to have all of the various objects that are related and exposed within the configuration. And so this will all be sort of familiar here with understanding, okay, well, let's take a look at entity in this case. And we'll see all of the various config properties here, for lack of a better word here. So setting up your GraphQL options, your REST options, permissions. This is where you'd go in if, let's say, you want to add a new property in the configuration. So one of the things that Jerry mentioned at the beginning of the stand-up call here is when we added caching. So caching was one of the properties that we were adding, and it's something that you would have to add as however you want to actually configure that here. So object model is where everything happens, and it would be the first place that I would go to kind of figure out what do I want to change, where do I need to change it. This is probably the first place that you'll go into. Let's see, what would be another good thing to check out. So that's kind of maybe the first peek at where you'd visit to look at making changes. But now that I realize it, I think another good thing to take a look at is the issues page. So this is obviously where you post any sort of bugs that need triage, response from our team, or requests for features. And this is also a place that you can take a look at the labels. So labels usually have a way to categorize anything that comes in. So specifying whether it's an engine issue, if it's an enhancement for new feature, um, if it's something that we need to investigate further, or if it's a known issue. So those are better ways to filter here. But the point that I wanted to raise is that when you're looking at these issues, I was trying to look for something good first issue. We might only have a handful here, but as we encounter issues, this may be a good place for us to say, oh, you know what, this actually looks pretty straightforward, but due to bandwidth constraints, we're going to add good first issue here if somebody wants to pick this up. I'd recommend this is the first place you look before going to make a change, because it makes everything easier for collaboration here. So instead of going in, making a change, and hoping that it will be accepted, this would be a good first place to come and find, oh, is it already reported as an issue? Have you
Mhm.
reached out to see if this is something that is, I guess, in our vision, or something that we might not be working on already? So that way we're not stepping on each other's toes. We don't duplicate your work, because we obviously want to get your change in, but want to make sure that it's something that everybody's aware of before you kind of go and work on it. So you find a good first issue here. And one thing to say, I mean, would be to ask questions, to add more details into the issue, to kind of clarify what exactly is it going to look like to accomplish closing this. And I would recommend, after kind of getting the team's acknowledgement, like, hey, I want to work on this, getting our acknowledgement saying, yeah, go ahead, it's all yours, and getting you assigned to the issue, and going ahead to make this particular change. I think that would be good kind of first signal that this change is going to be coming, and it won't necessarily be a surprise. And I bring this point up because there have been instances where changes have come up, and either we are working on a slightly different design but same sort of functionality already, and so
Yeah.
that would take precedence in this case. And so we wouldn't want your hard work to go to waste. And just, it's what we do on our own team to make sure that all of our engineering team members are working in good coordination, and are not going to step on each other when they work on their fixes or new features.
Sean, what would you recommend if I have an idea that isn't currently in the issues list?
Add it to the issues list. We have a good, well, we have a bug report here, but I think that would be a good opportunity to add a new template. But opening up a blank issue, calling it a enhancement or feature request, and adding as many details as you can to make the use case clear. So if you have a new feature request, not necessarily just saying, I want Dab to do this, but what would it look like from your end? What benefits are you gaining from it?
Yeah.
Is it going to have certain output in the Dab CLI? Is it going to have an effect on what your generated GraphQL schema looks like, your REST endpoint? Maybe it's something that you see in the OpenAPI document that we generate that you want to
Hmm.
be either added or fixed. And so that was something that came up recently, that there was a issue with the way that our OpenAPI document was generated, that certain tooling did not like the format of the doc, or it was missing a property. And so the user who added that issue was really helpful with adding like screenshots, adding documentation, or maybe references to the OpenAPI specification, or maybe even giving direct links to what their tooling was, what the error messages from their tooling was, especially if it's paid tooling. So I can't necessarily go in and go in and just download and start using a paid tool. So as much information from that as possible will help me or our other teammates go in and make the fixes possible. And so that was something that was that came up recently that we were able to add the fix for, and so that's going to be coming up in the next release. But that's just something that people out there, they see something that's not there, and they'll go and we'll collaborate on it.
Nice. If I add an issue and I'm ready to get started, should I wait, or should I wait for feedback, or should go ahead and get started? What would you say is the best practice there?
I would just at least a day or two just to tag some of the maintainers just to get get some opinion out there, because if there happens to be a duplicate, it might come to mind quicker
Yeah.
from us just to
Yeah.
say, hey, actually this issue is pretty similar. We did see it come up a while ago. While it didn't have the exact same language that you specified, it does have similar themes that we would like to consolidate into a single issue, or here's some more details that maybe will help you get started to this and how you think about approaching your solution.
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, once you have the actual issue opened and you decide and everything's all good to start working on something, obviously coming into Visual Studio to start working on your code to make changes. So my view might be a little different from yours because I am a maintainer on the repo. So my process will be cloning the repo directly and working from there. But if you're an outside contributor, obviously you're going to probably need to fork the repo, pull all of that code from your forked repo locally, and then make your changes. And that will just affect the pull request process. So once you're ready to contribute your code from your forked repo, you'll say open up a PR against the upstream project here, and then we'll go through the PR experience. But from my side, I mean, the first thing I would do, that I do in all of my processes, just go ahead and create a new branch and bring whatever changes I'm working on. And let's see, what would be a good first thing to do? I'm going to just do something super simple just to demonstrate the process for those who maybe not have, who maybe haven't done any of this before. So if I go into, let's see if this will load here. I'm going to go into directory build.props and just something super simple. Now that we've released version 1.1 of DAB, I'm going to just go ahead and make a simple change to update the minor version to version 1.2.
Okay.
And so this is more of a trivial change, I understand, but at the same time here, what I'm trying to demonstrate is once you do have file changes, it's just as simple as committing those to your branch and ensuring that that change can be pushed up. So, and then going to go and go, that's not going to work real quick. Um, One second while I launch. I sign all of my commits. You don't have to do this from your side. And I think the demo gods got me. Well, that will not push right now. There's some dependency on my GPG agent that is too old. Well, that I think is due to Patch Tuesday yesterday, so I probably should not have updated anything in anticipation of a demo. But in the case that this did actually pop up, I'd get my password here, punch in the password to sign my commit, and push. And once that commit is actually up into my repo here, it would just be as simple as contributing the branch here. So
Mm-hmm.
um, this one is an older branch, but yeah, essentially that would be what I would do. From your branch, you would contribute that here. And once you have a PR open, let's take this one here from one of my colleagues, doing the same exact thing here. So updating the version to 1.2, you'll see your file changes here. And as a contributor, actually, let's see, we have a just one of the open PRs, for example, you'll see one of the, might have been deleted, but one of the things that pops up for a contributor is one of our GitHub policy agreements. It'll comment on your PR asking you to agree. So it's just essentially saying that you agree to the common community terms. I think it's similar across Microsoft on code contributions for open source, but that's just something that pops up if you have more than just a trivial change, multiple lines of code that are being changed. And so that's just a standard agreement that comes across for all PRs.
Mm-hmm.
And then once that is agreed to, one of our teammates here will come and do AZP run to kick off all the pipelines. And so that's just something that we have to do, but it'll essentially run all of your pipelines for the various databases that we have checks for. So first we'll run the unit tests, and then MS SQL, MySQL, Postgres, Cosmos, and such. And so all of those will then run. Any issues that come up, obviously we'll ask you to make sure to fix your tests. And with that being said, I think the next leading question here is, well, how do I actually make sure my tests are passing? And do I need to just depend on these pipelines to run? And the answer is no, you don't need, you shouldn't depend on these pipelines to run. What you can do is from Visual Studio here, or I think in VS Code, we have a tests project. And so this has all of the tests that are related to all of our services in DAB. And before adding any sort of changes, maybe not with this version bump, but if, like, let's say you're changing a property in the configuration or fixing a bug in, I don't know, how the GraphQL endpoint works, you're going to want to go into, like, for example, the SQL tests here and find test folders related to the particular area that you are adding changes. So for GraphQL, most likely either the change is going to end up in GraphQL Builder, which is the code that is responsible for creating the GraphQL or the GraphQL schema, which is used by Hot Chocolate behind the scenes. So that would be how these would be tests that check all of that GraphQL schema assets and properties and such. But if you want to add integration tests, which is like, okay, once the schema is created, DAB is started, and the endpoints are published, well, I want to test my request end to end. I want to provide DAB a custom GraphQL request and see how it responds and ensure that my request is properly exercising the new code that I wrote. And so this would be the location where you would do so. And so in here, this is a GraphQL query test for MS SQL. So essentially what this is going to be testing is, given a particular GraphQL query, making sure that the appropriate MS SQL results are returned. And in this case, these tests are using T-SQL for Azure SQL or SQL Server to ensure that the results are returned as expected. And the reason we do that is because their DAB essentially generates different SQL or different T-SQL syntax, or the specific syntax for different databases. So MySQL, Postgres will have different syntax, and that's where some of these tests will have us be writing queries and those for those different databases to ensure that the results are returned as expected. So like the JSON responses from SQL Server are going to be slightly different from Postgres in terms of how you write the query. And once you do add those tests, then it would be going into Test Explorer here and running those tests. And this would be essentially what our pipelines run. And so you can run these all locally, and that would just require a few different changes from your end. So as you come into this test project here, you'll see a handful of files here. So these are all DAB configs related to these specific databases. And so the reason why we have separate files is because different databases might have slightly different options available. So for SQL Server, we obviously have the set session context, and that's not going to be something that's present in Cosmos, for example. But the first thing that you would have to go in here and do is modify the connection string to point to your database instance. No problem showing my connection string here because I'm not using a username and password. But in this case, this is just pointing to the data API builder database that I created for my local SQL Server instance. And so you would have to make sure to update the configuration for each of the databases that you have. So for example, if you have MySQL and Postgres, you would be able to go into Docker, and if you don't have MySQL Postgres installed natively, I mean, one of the easy things to do would just be to pull a Docker container for those specific databases. And so one of the things that I have on my end, let's see, I might not have it here, but for example, like downloading the MySQL and Postgres images, spinning up containers, and that just makes it really simple to get up and running. So if you just a matter of a few Docker pull commands to get those databases up and running, and then you can essentially have full coverage of running all the tests against all the databases locally. Um, that is where some of the pipelines come in handy, where if you're only targeting a specific database, like if you're working on code for how queries are generated for SQL Server, maybe you're only going to want to test SQL Server code locally and just make sure you're pointing to your local SQL Server instance. And so all of the tests are uh, the tests do all of the database setup for you. So as long as you have your connection string here, it should just be a matter of running the tests, and it will utilize some of these SQL files to deploy all the SQL assets. Um, Something that will be utilized in the future, I know Jerry's thinking this, is we can work on adding DAC packs here to make this a lot more streamlined, but that would be for SQL Server specifically. But I digress on that point. But that's some of the areas of where the testing would come into play, and getting these things run locally will really speed up your own process.
So I can use the
Yeah,
existing tests to see if I've introduced a regression somehow. I can
right.
use integration tests to make sure things are working together. Um, I could also create my own unit test and add it to the family of tests.
That's right.
And do you have, are there kind of not policies, but guidelines that the team follows today around code coverage?
Not a policy in particular, but I think at least with changes that are coming through, making sure that there are in fact tests that are added to hit the code that is written. And so we're not going to ask you to go and fill in code coverage gaps for places that you might not have um, touched in the code base. But if it's something that can be covered by adding a test to say, here's a sample GraphQL request, here's a sample dab config, and want to demonstrate that your code is in fact working, then that's something that you'll have to add to your code. So things like syntax changes or maybe version updates, package updates, like for dependencies, like those won't necessarily require specific tests to be written. But from my recollection, like recent code contributions of changing configuration properties, those will require tests. And what that means is that we have tests for the CLI, which is essentially when you say dab start, dab init, that's the CLI. And so all of those verbs that are associated with the CLI, so dab add, dab start, those all have tests associated with those verbs, which would then necessitate adding tests to check any new options you might add, making sure that the config file is parsed correctly depending on what values you provide. So for example, if you have let's see, what would be a good example here? Some of the new properties like max response size, for example, there are many values that you can set there, some of which
Mhm.
have special meaning. And so depending on whether you set null, -1, 0, or a positive integer, those do have different implications on the runtime. And so whether they are supported value, or if they mean use the default value, or this just means have dab defer to the maximum value, those are all various tests that would need to be added to the test project to ensure that you have proper coverage. And so examples of those would be in configuration tests. And so this is fairly large file, but you have, let's see here. Yeah, max, oh, that was a good scroll down. So this is max depth limit for a different max depth property. But here, what this test is doing is checking for different setting values that you provide and ensuring that dab actually honors that. And so what this test essentially does behind the scenes is making sure that when you set a specific value, that when dab is started and you execute a request, that value is honored as you had inputted it to the config. So things like that would be super important to have. There are also pre-existing examples here that you can refer to get up and running with the test. So if you're like, well, how do I mock a dab config file? Well, for example, this test here has a bunch of sample code to set all of that up, get a instance of the server, which is the dab service running. So that way you can then essentially just write GraphQL requests to send to the endpoint and ensure that you get the appropriate response that would then indicate success.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be essentially my advice for making sure when you're submitting changes to have tests written. Of course, if you're completely unsure of where to start there, that's where adding comments to the issue that represents your change, like adding comments, starting discussion, tagging us, that would be a good option to ask for help there. Like, okay, how do I add a test for this? Or maybe not that big, but saying, hey, here's my change. Here's the kind of test I want to write. I'm having trouble creating a dab config to represent what I want. Here's what I've done so far. What am I missing? That would be a good ask for help, or a good example of asking for help, like saying what you've done, what you're exactly are you having trouble with, so that way it's really clear to jump in and say, oh, you're missing XYZ. If you're vague, saying, oh, I don't know where to start, that doesn't really give us anything to go off of, and I'm sure if somebody did that on your end, you'd be asking for more details up front. So to save the back and forth, as many details as possible is always appreciated. And with that being said, that also leads me to uh, PR descriptions. And so we do have a really nice template that when you do create a pull request, let's see. Let's just pull up one of the more recent ones here. Yeah, so for example, here, a few of the headers that show up when you open a PR is why you're making this change. This is where you can link directly to the issue that's being closed that associates one-to-one which issue you are actually closing. And so if somebody
Mm-hmm.
wants additional context, that maybe there are a lot of screenshots and discussion, that would be a quick link to open up the issue to go and look at what's going on. Any additional details, sometimes it's a little bit helpful if you can give like a 1 or 2 sentence summary of like what you're actually solving. Um, that does prevent having to open a link in a new tab and just look at all the context. And so uh, anything to kind of make it a quick glance through and understand what's going on. So what is the change? Kind of get a few bullet points on what exactly are you changing. Obviously, we have the how was this tested. So going back to what I spoke to earlier, saying that yes, indeed, I did actually add unit tests and or integration tests. You know, don't necessarily need both, but fulfilling one of these is needed to make sure that when we do add this code to the code base, that there is some sort of code that we can protect against regressions and ensure that you're actually adding something that is going to not break.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
sample request, this is not always needed, but is definitely helpful. So saying, well, what is the exact error message, or what can I expect to see before this fix was added, and then what happens after the fix is added, and showing that, okay, you get correct results now, or you're getting the correct formatting and something that you might expect. Another way to potentially make this even more helpful um, is not necessarily even screenshots, but you can add Markdown that you can copy and paste the request in. And so if I wanted to, for example, clone your branch and just go and make sure it works locally for me, I can just copy and paste this request into my browser and ensure it works. And so those are just um, little tips and tricks to kind of
So
make things
sometimes text
easier.
is better than a screenshot just so you can reuse
Right,
it.
exactly. And sometimes it might not be visible. Um, so yeah, it's not that screenshots are not useful, but sometimes the text is even better to have. And so yeah, once you get a PR submitted, then it will be in our queue for review, and then we'll come and add comments as appropriate and making sure tests are run. So
Now, Sean, let me
yeah,
ask you, I create a PR, and do I need to set some labels and put it in a specific project to make sure that you guys review it?
nope, nothing is required except for just publishing the PR, and that should be good enough. So all the project stuff is just for us to categorize. It's usually just for the issues. I'm not 100% certain that this even shows up publicly, but it, it is
Oh,
something
okay.
that, yeah, it's for us to keep everything organized. So we have our own triaging templates and project planning boards that we use.
Got it. That after this, it's just trust the process, and there might be a lot of back and forth at this point. And well, maybe this is worth actually a different type of discussion for now. That if you're going to be contributing back to the repository, I think one thing to keep in mind is don't be in a hurry, because for one, the team is already we already have a specific capacity, and we're already using that to make sure that we're adding features and doing other things to the code base as well. So coming to your PR is part of that process, but it's not necessarily something we'll do this afternoon. And so I'm like, if I'm very, very proud of my code and I'm excited for the team to see it, I just keep hitting F5 over and over and over on my browser, waiting to see feedback, and nobody's giving it back. I don't want to be, I don't want to be disillusioned by that, because the team will get to it. It's just a matter of time. More importantly, even were it to be merged into the code base, it will still fall into the normal release cycle of DAB. So we won't have a special release unless you're fixing some sort of unbelievably egregious security problem. We're not going to have a special release for the code that I just did. Instead, it'll kind of go into the normal release cycle, which could be several weeks from now.
Right. And that's not to say that you couldn't use your own code. I mean, once you make a change, and if you are ready and able to go and add your own changes, I mean, running DAB locally is a completely valid option. We do have the code and configuration files in place if you wanted to go and spin up your own, I guess, Docker container. In this case, we have our Docker folder here with some of our Docker Compose. So
Mhm.
if you just cannot wait and want to get something in your test environment to start going, I mean, that's obviously something that you are very free and able to go and do, and the resources are there. I think we do actually have docs on this as well, on the AKMS/DAB docs, or DAB/docs, and
Mhm.
so that's options that are available to make things easier. And one of the things we've recently been starting is adding configuration for the dev container. Right now, this is only just to kind of get things working for code reviews. So some of the bigger code changes, um, those will require going into I think the term is dev container in this case. What do they call it here? Code space. So going into GitHub code spaces will make things really easy, at least in my perspective, to review, because sometimes the bigger changes, you don't get the full context looking at the GitHub UI. And so I use code spaces to go in and review code and mark things off. So that's what our dev container config is doing. But there is another colleague of ours that's working on some really cool dev, at least with DAB, trying to just get DAB working in a dev container. And so that would be something
Mhm.
that we'd want to adopt into this, to just be able to use DAB locally, or maybe you don't want to have SQL Server installed. We can make that easier for you. And so right now, I
Yeah.
demonstrated that earlier by spinning up Docker containers for MySQL. That's just another thing to make life easier to work on. And let's see here. I guess, speaking of which, for the PR complexity, if you start realizing that your code is getting really, really large, like if your code
Mhm.
change is very extensive, like once it starts getting up into hundreds and over 1,000, that does get to be really large. And so that's where we'd ask, like, if you can see whether there is any other way to incrementally introduce your changes, like that's something that you can plan out in the GitHub issue to ensure that whatever you are working on, well, maybe we can help you identify, well, maybe you can work on the config section first if you're adding a config property.
Hmm.
Then you can move on to adding engine code to handle that new config value. And then once you do that, then you can have another change that actually utilizes the config value that the engine has read in to then have certain logic. And so that makes things easier to review. And so if you do want your code reviewed quicker, the more concise the code is, so smaller the PRs, the easier and quicker it will become to review and iterate on those changes.
Yeah, that's good advice. It still makes sense, even though I'm forking it, to still use branches and still be able to contain some of my changes into branches as well, so
Right.
that I can have multiple pull requests that still have cascading relationships between them. Let me just say two quick things that I want to add to this. When I am submitting a pull request, I want to make sure that I am explaining to the development team everything that I'm doing and the reason why I'm doing it. However, the in addition to that, if something that I'm doing causes the behavior of dab to change, I also want to make sure that I include in that the documentation changes that need to occur as well. So we want to make sure that docs for dab are also updated. And so nobody understands the change you made better than you. So it makes total sense for you to go ahead and indicate which files inside documentation need to be altered and what those changes need to be. Then we can go in and make those changes. That's no big deal. But it's a big help if you kind of point us in the right direction to make sure we get everything correct. Obviously, we're going to understand how it works once we have it merged and we're starting to use it as well, just to give us a head start on making sure the documentation is correct.
Absolutely. And
The
then I
other
guess
is
if you
when you're
really
trying to
want to
decide what your changes are. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sean.
I was gonna say, if you really want to take the initiative, like going to our DAB docs here, like they are editable in GitHub, at least at the moment. And so um, going in to identify where you want to make some changes, you can get an initial PR started, and then our docs team will kind of help take take it to the finish line. But if you
Yeah,
absolutely know where the change needs to be made, like that can be another PR that you add to your repertoire of changes that you've made and contributed to DAB. So more the merrier, and
that's right.
happy to get
Now
anything.
that works today. If anybody watching this video in the future, all of a sudden the pencil is not present when they're on docs, let's have the fallback plan B to be that to include it in your PR, because it's an easy
Yeah,
thing then for us to be able to integrate as well, because there might be some changes coming to the way docs are edited publicly now. That being said, one other thing that I think is at least worth talking about is when you want to make a change to dab, there are one of the things you should consider there are two things that matter to us. One is backwards compatibility. So regardless, let's pretend one of the flags that we have added to our CLI isn't the standard way of adding a specific flag, right? I can't think of it, but let's say init needs to be initialized, right? And init is not actually a supported term in the industry. It's always initialized. And so your PR then is to come in and change it so that our CLI then is initialized instead of init. Now you're doing a big favor to us because you're helping make everything standardized. But however, now we're crossing this really unfortunate line of backwards compatibility, making it so that all of our developers who are currently using DAB, if they upgrade to the next version that includes your changes, won't be able to use it in a way that they are expecting to, and their current implementations might actually fail. So as you're starting to design a feature or a change, remember backwards compatibility and have some mercy on the existing developers out there who already have systems in place automating it or programmatically interacting with DAB. So that's an important step, even as you're just thinking about the design of what it is you're going to do next. The other is considering which database is going to be impacted. So right now with Postgres, MySQL, with Cosmos, SQL Server, and SQL DW, Data Warehouse, all supported. Making a change that only really affects one, and so you're like, well, honestly, I only use SQL Server, so I'm going to make this an implementation specific to SQL Server. that doesn't really help because we want to have parity across the databases as much as we can. So when we see your PR and it really helps Postgres, for example, we want to make sure that the other databases aren't left out as well. So it could really introduce some time for the acceptance of your PR as we start to kind of spread that out and make sure that either we accept the lack of parity or we add parity to it. So that's something that you could do. But there's kind of philosophically something you could do as well. And that is to back something up away from the database completely and maybe make the change in the engine instead of in the database kind of implementation. And so, Sean, talk to me just a little bit about how how would you how would you focus on the engine for a change to make sure that if I make a change in the engine, that applies to everybody?
That would be on a case by case basis, but I think a good example may be probably for the GraphQL builder. So this would be in the situation where you are adding to the GraphQL schema. So anything that's related to what ends up in the GraphQL schema is in this part of the project. And so kind of elevating, I don't have a specific example here, but this is kind of just pointing to where in the code I would look at is the GraphQL schema that's generated is essentially database agnostic. Things where it really matters which database is used on the back end is query generation. And so that is in a different part of the project in our resolvers. And so that is in the core resolvers folder. And so that's where you're going to have database specific code. But if your change, obviously case by case basis, depending on what it is, you might not have to go to that level of granularity to the database level. And it might just be somewhere that's higher up in the DAB code base, logically higher up. So maybe you're dealing with something that happens before any sort of code that deals with databases might come into play.
Yeah.
One
That
thing
that
that,
actually
yeah,
makes it so that your code is even easier to check as well because you're making these changes before we even start thinking about which backend source we're talking to.
right. But because DAB is one of those things that it is built around the database, it might be inevitable that you're going to be touching database specific code.
Yeah.
And so that's where, again, probably in the issue, we would ask that you say, okay, my test specifically affects Cosmos, for example. Do I need to worry about SQL Server or Postgres? Is this something that might be scoped to just Cosmos? In that case, we can talk through that, and if it needs to affect other databases, we'll want to probably at least have issues opened up just to
Right.
track that, because
Right.
sometimes that might, if they need to have parity across databases, that might roll into that slippery slope of getting a mega PR, and we do want to avoid
Right.
that because that the more changes that you're adding, the more chances there are of there being a
Mhm.
regression, and it just makes it easier to review and test doing
Yeah.
incremental changes. But yeah, case by case basis, but of course that's where the issues and the discussions come into play, and so don't be afraid to uh, reach out on there, and we'll be able to get to that as quickly as we can. Sometimes there are
Now,
delays,
if
but
if
yeah.
there was a if there was concern about coding style, we do have a master editor config right there in the root of the source folder. So that should make it so that everybody using Visual Studio automatically gets hints from IntelliSense, making sure that they're formatting their code in a way that's consistent with the rest of the code base.
Right. Yep. We have the code analyzers and Salcop, so some things might be a little different than what you might be used to, and that's just some of the legacy of Data API Builder when it first started. So, like you'll see that there's really no use of var in here, and we're very explicit with the types that we're using. And so that might be the first glaring change that might be different from your own code. That is something that we do here in DAB, and so that's just something that you'd want to keep in mind. And the code editors like Visual Studio, VS Code will let you know when you are working on your changes.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I mean, a simple thing like var as an example, and actually most of the things that show up in editor config, you can go ahead and write the code in the structure that you like, and then kind of let Visual Studio do some refactoring for you as you get ready for your PR as well. So
Yeah,
if it
.NET
drives you
format.
crazy and you just find yourself typing var, it's not the end of the world, right? It'll be able to fix that for you.
Yep, and .NET format will obviously help, so we're not introducing additional new lines when
Right.
there doesn't need to be, or when there don't need to be new lines, and organizing your using. So some of these things will end up failing the pipeline. That does come up a lot. So one of the things that which should probably be added as a commit hook, but it's .NET format. Remember to run that, and that'll make
Yeah.
checking in way easier.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Sean. Certainly, there have been a lot of discussions around how do I get started. This is a nice place for as a resource for developers who are wanting to contribute back to the code base. So I appreciate you walk through this with us. I want to bring us back to the documentation here, just as a reminder of where Sean started. If you go in and you type, you can type source, you can type GitHub, you can type repository. There's all kinds of ways to get to it, but they all end up taking you run from source code. This will be a nice starting place for you to kind of walk through the forking of our repository to your own, cloning it locally so that you can interact with it and start making changes as well, and just getting the engine running as well. It might be handy to look at this and then reflect back on this video as well and see what Sean was showing as far as having your own local configuration file and setting up your own containers so that you can run tests as well. So that's where this is. And one thing I want to make sure that I leave you with is if we go back to the repository itself and we go back to the homepage of the repository, so many of you, and it's been really great, so many of you have already joined the community here through the form here, and it's really a terrific way for us to be able to have questions. We're putting together a survey right now to help us prioritize some of the things in our backlog, or more in our roadmap is a better way to think of it. And this is where that survey goes out to. So if you'd like to be part of Data API Builder as part of the community, be informed whenever there are new releases, as well as when we have these community stand-ups, and be part of the conversation around our roadmap. This is how you get involved right there. Just go ahead and sign up. You'll get an email from me after you do, and we can go through what your use case is, or you can just be part of the community. So it's really a terrific way to get started. So thank you for so many of you who have already joined. And if you're interested in joining in, that's the place to do it. All right. Well, thank you, Sean. I think this is going to close out the community stand-up for this month. Next month as well, we are going to be the second week instead of the first week. So let me just pull up the dates to remind me. Next week, the first Wednesday is the 7th. That's not going to be the Data API Builder community stand-up here. Instead, it'll be on the 14th. So that's good. Gives us a little bit more runway to have news and information as well. If you have questions in the meantime, jump over to the repository, add an issue, and we'll talk to you there. Join into the discussion. Go over to the discussion tab. You can see we're talking about some items that are coming up in the backlog soon. And until next time, Sean, thanks for being on the call, and everybody else, goodbye.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Sean.